They say the Megalodon died out 3 million years ago, but no one was there to see it die. No witness, no record, only silence. A silence so vast that it could swallow truth itself. The ocean keeps many kinds of secrets, and extinction may simply be one of its softer lies. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is there. Somewhere beyond the continental shelves, in a pressure zone where sunlight fades into cold cobalt haze, the world remains almost untouched. Down there, nothing ages the way we imagine. Flesh dissolves slowly, bones sink through darkness, and the temperature preserves everything, even the idea of something that should no longer exist. We call it Megalodon, the ancient giant, the apex of all oceans, a shark large enough to bite a whale in half, a predator whose existence rewrote the meaning of fear. We've built entire museums around its teeth, black, massive, serrated like obsidian blades, displayed as relics of a vanished era. And yet in private, even the most seasoned marine biologists admit one thing: the ocean is mostly unmapped. 95% of it has never been seen, which means our certainty rests on a map that is mostly blank. The official narrative is tidy. Fossil evidence stops abruptly at the end of the Pliocene. Climate change cooled the seas. Prey populations collapsed. Megalodon disappeared. End of story. But the end of a story told by sediment is not the same as the end of the creature itself. Teeth can fall into ancient beds and resurface through tectonic motion. Carbon dating can distort under mineral exchange, and ocean currents can move fossils for thousands of kilometers. What if some of those ancient teeth that wash ashore still hold a trace of warmth because they are not as ancient as we believe? There have been finds that make scientists hesitate. A tooth dredged from the deep near the Mariana Basin, edges sharp enough to slice skin. Another found off the coast of Chile, still coated with collagen residue that should have vanished millions of years ago. They were dismissed as contamination, misdating, coincidence. But the pattern remains. The ocean gives, the ocean retracts, and our explanations become patchwork over a mystery that refuses to sleep. Perhaps extinction, in its human definition, is too absolute for a planet that never stops shifting. The coelacanth was once declared gone for 66 million years, until it surfaced alive off the coast of South Africa, its blue scales shimmering like a dream that had been waiting. If time could fold that way once, who decides how often it can happen? Under the surface, where even light loses its will to travel, survival becomes almost invisible. Pressure reshapes biology, temperature slows metabolism, and movement turns minimal, just enough to persist. The deep sea is not a place of death. It is a place where death takes longer to notice. Imagine a creature adapted to silence, following ancient migratory instincts through submarine canyons, far below the sonar nets and camera grids. It would not need to surface. It would not need to be seen. It would only need to feed. And the carcasses that fall from the upper ocean, the whales that die and sink whole, could sustain such a being without trace. A world of endless night, of slow drifting shadows, could easily hide a survivor from a surface that only believes in what it can measure. In 1954, a U.S. Navy submarine reported a sonar contact the size of a small freighter, moving at a speed no known whale could reach. Classified at the time as unidentified biological. The file was declassified decades later, but remained inconclusive. Around the same decade, deep-sea cables laid across the Pacific were found with massive bite impressions, the spacing between teeth wider than any living shark's jaw. They said it was pressure distortion, cable strain, anything but what it looked like. The sea can always provide excuses. Even now, modern oceanographers admit that over 2/3 of large biological sonar echoes remain unexplained. They call them false positives. Machines hear what the mind refuses. In the abyss, where pressure equals oblivion, our instruments stutter, and something stirs beyond calibration. Maybe the Megalodon didn't die. Maybe it retreated, following the ancient cold currents, sinking deeper as the surface changed. Perhaps what we call extinction is only migration into invisibility. The fossil record is not a grave. It's a footprint that disappears when the sand shifts. But then comes the deeper question. Why do we want it dead so badly? Why does our species find comfort in declaring the monstrous extinct? Maybe because acknowledging its possibility forces us to face the scale of what we still don't understand. To admit that the ocean is not conquered, that there are still shadows longer than our science. In every generation, there are those who claim to have seen something vast in the fog. Whalers in the 1800s wrote of a pale fin the length of a brigantine's mast. A Japanese research vessel in the 1960s photographed a massive, blurred shape beneath a pod of sperm whales, so large it distorted the surrounding water. The image was quietly archived. Perhaps these are only illusions, misreadings of scale, echoes, shadows, tricks of current and fear. But illusion itself has weight. Collective imagination does not bloom without a seed. The deep ocean has always mirrored the human mind, both filled with things half remembered, half believed. If a creature like the Megalodon still drifts through those trenches, it would not announce itself. It would wait. It would move through centuries as if they were hours. Its hunger would be slow, patient, and perfect. And maybe that is why we feel a strange nostalgia for it. Because in every story of the deep, there is an echo of something older than extinction. A reminder that the planet's memory is not ours to edit. When the current grows quiet and the water darkens to the color of absence, sometimes the hydrophones record a pulse, a sound like thunder stretched into a whisper. It comes from no known species. It fades before triangulation, and scientists label it unidentified biological noise, then move on. But the ocean remembers. It always remembers. And somewhere in that black quiet, the first tremor of a moving shadow reminds us that the map of life is still unfinished, and the silence between discoveries is wider than we think. There's a tooth that shouldn't exist. Pulled from a deep-sea dredge near the Solomon Trench in 1959, its edges were too clean, its enamel too white, its serration still capable of cutting through skin. The ocean floor it came from dated to less than 10,000 years ago, a blink in geologic time. The scientists who found it stored it away quietly, the official report marking it as reworked sediment. But some things resist easy explanations. A fossil that looks young, a predator that feels ancient, a silence that seems intentional. Teeth are supposed to be eternal, the hardest part of any vertebrate body, but even enamel erodes with time, bleached gray by pressure and mineral exchange. That tooth didn't have the texture of the dead. It had sheen, luster, as if it hadn't yet finished living. The crew who handled it joked nervously that the ocean had coughed up something it wasn't done with. It was sent to a museum archive in Auckland, and for years, no one spoke of it again. Later, during a series of deep ocean dredging operations in the 1980s, 2 more teeth appeared. One off the coast of Madagascar, one from the abyss near Peru. Both larger than any great whites, both seemingly too recent to fit into the Pliocene graveyard, where science had entombed the Megalodon. Laboratory dating produced conflicting results, and each time, researchers blamed contamination. But the contamination itself became a pattern. As if reality kept interfering with its own narrative. There are whispers that some institutions quietly reclassified those teeth as modern imitations, not out of fraud, but preservation, to avoid rewriting too much. Because to admit that something of that scale might still exist beneath us would break more than one kind of certainty. The ocean has always resisted closure. The more we map it, the more it dissolves. Even with sonar, we only touch the outlines of its sleep. We forget that fossils are not confined to one timeline. Geological forces can stir them like dreams. But what if those stirred layers are not just fossils being lifted, but something alive pressing upward, moving the sand from below? In 2013, a South African marine biologist named Dale Pearson analyzed bite marks on a pod of dead whales washed ashore near Cape Town. The spacing was 20 centimeters between each tooth impression, double that of any known shark. The pattern of crushing, not tearing, resembled the biomechanics of a megalodon jaw, reconstructed from Miocene fossils. Pearson submitted the report. It was reviewed, then quietly buried. Funding for follow-up expeditions vanished. He left research a year later. It's easy to laugh at legends. Easier still to dismiss inconvenient data as anomaly. But anomalies are how the unknown keeps breathing inside the known. Each misdated tooth, each unaccounted wound, each misread sonar ping. Together they form a pulse. Weak, irregular, but steady. And yet, the deeper puzzle is not the teeth. It's the absence between them. For a species that dominated the oceans for millions of years, the sudden erasure of Megalodon fossils from the record feels too clean. Evolution rarely writes such abrupt endings. Usually there are transitional forms, scattered traces of decline. Here, there is only an edge, then silence. Some paleontologists argue that tectonic movements may have buried entire fossil beds beneath continental drift. Others suggest the sediments holding later fossils were subducted into the mantle, lost forever. But such theories don't explain the odd clustering of two young finds that emerge far from ancient strata. In oceanic trenches still active today, there's an unsettling symmetry between what's missing and what's appearing. It's as if the record itself is being rewritten by the medium that guards it. The sea erasing, revealing, rearranging. The fossil as an edit, not a memory. And in that ambiguity, human psychology does what it always does. It fills silence with imagination. Sightings multiply, patterns form. Some sailors speak of hearing low-frequency vibrations through ship hulls when crossing certain abyssal zones, like a slow heartbeat against steel. Submariners report sonar shadows the length of passenger planes, moving with deliberate, unhurried grace. But the logs rarely make it to print. Classified data sinks faster than bones. It's strange. The same ocean that gives us calm also carries this low, ancient dread. To look into it too long is to feel watched. And perhaps that's why the Megalodon myth endures. Not because we want it to exist, but because some part of us feels that something down there still does. In 1999, a research vessel from Japan's National Fisheries Agency recorded a submersible camera feed at 1,800 meters depth near the Ogasawara Islands. For 42 seconds, a massive shape drifted across frame, its movement fluid, predatory, without the stiff undulation of whales. The footage was grainy, murky, barely decipherable. The scientists estimated its size at 20 meters, possibly a giant squid. But squid don't swim that way. The footage was archived, never released. Only a few still frames were shown at a closed conference in Tokyo in 2001. After that, silence. There's always silence at the end of discovery. Because knowledge is not just built by what is found. It's guarded by what is allowed to be believed. A handful of marine biologists off the record have admitted something quietly radical: that the age of deep-sea exploration is still too young to declare anything extinct. There are still ecosystems we have never glimpsed, trenches whose pressures our machines can't survive. Whole species of cephalopods and fish have been discovered in just the last decade, some larger than the submarines that found them. If such creatures could remain unseen for millennia, why not something older, slower, deeper? The real question isn't whether the Megalodon still exists. It's whether our definition of existence is broad enough to hold what the ocean refuses to show. Because maybe the creature isn't entirely physical anymore. Maybe what survives of it is older than biology. An echo, a will, a pattern encoded in the water itself. An instinct that keeps recurring through different forms, like a memory that the ocean dreams in mussel and fin. When a whale dies, it sinks, creating what scientists call a whale fall, a sudden oasis of life for decades on the abyssal plain. Shrimp, worms, sharks, and unseen feeders gather in silence. But sometimes, those sites vanish overnight. Not decayed, not dispersed, but gone. As if something immense swallowed the entire ecosystem whole. Perhaps that's only scavengers, perhaps currents, perhaps pressure collapse, or perhaps something older feeds where light cannot reach, following the rhythm of death itself. And if so, the Megalodon isn't extinct. It's just waiting for us to stop insisting on seeing it. Because in the deepest parts of the ocean, survival doesn't need to be witnessed. It only needs to continue. The tooth in that museum drawer still gleams under dim glass. The enamel hasn't dulled. The serrations haven't worn. It sits between fossils labeled Miocene, though no one is certain it belongs there. Visitors walk by without looking closely. And maybe that's the point. Somewhere, the sea is still writing. It just doesn't need us to read. The deeper you go, the more everything disappears. Light, color, sound, even the idea of scale. At 6,000 meters below, the ocean becomes something else entirely. Scientists call it the Hadal zone, named after Hades, the realm of the dead. But it is not death that rules there. It's absence. A silence so complete that sound bends within it. In those black trenches, the laws of perception dissolve, and only movement remains real. The Mariana Trench alone is nearly 11 kilometers deep, enough to swallow Mount Everest whole and still have room to spare. Only a handful of vessels have ever touched its floor, and even then, for minutes at most. What they bring back is never clear. Grainy footage, unexplained readings, equipment that stops working without reason. Sometimes, the sound logs come back warped, echoes that don't match their own transmissions, as if something enormous shifted nearby, unseen. In 1997, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration recorded a sound unlike any other. A deep organic rumble detected by multiple hydrophones across the Pacific. They called it the bloop. For years, the public imagined it was a living creature, perhaps the largest ever recorded. Later, NOAA announced it was ice fracturing. But many who analyzed the waveform disagreed. Ice doesn't produce harmonics that mimic respiration. The bloop had rhythm, pattern. It rose and fell like something breathing. That's the thing about the deep. It doesn't need to reveal itself. It only needs to remind us it's still there. Some researchers believe vast biological masses move in the deep. Large enough to shift pressure readings, but too soft to reflect sonar clearly. The signals ripple through the water. Brief, irregular, like distant thunder. They call these anomalies biologic shadows. Others say it's simply tectonic activity, but the frequencies don't align. And sometimes, the pulses respond, returning sound after sound stops, as if listening back. What kind of life could exist there? Unseen for millions of years, evolving under eternal darkness. Without light, color is meaningless. Without warmth, metabolism slows to near stillness. Creatures grow pale, translucent, enormous, following no rules but survival. The ocean floor is littered with vents that exhale superheated water and methane. Around them bloom ecosystems that defy biology. Shrimp without eyes, worms taller than men, bacteria that feed on rock. If life can thrive on minerals and pressure, why not flesh older than the Ice Age? The black zone is not empty. It's merely indifferent to us. We measure its floor, but it measures us back in silence. Each submarine that descends brings light where none belongs, and the abyss absorbs it like memory, swallowing the beam whole until even the brightest lamps fade into gray. Cameras can't focus. Instruments drift. It's as if the ocean itself resists being witnessed. In one descent logged by the Trieste in 1960, Lieutenant Don Walsh described seeing a large shape outside the viewport. Vague, massive, vanishing in the stirred silt. He never claimed it was a Megalodon. He never claimed anything. But years later, when questioned, he said the strangest thing wasn't what he saw. It was what he felt. A pressure that wasn't physical, as if the water itself were aware of him. It's tempting to imagine something ancient still roaming there. Slower now, colder, transformed by eons of isolation. The Megalodon we know from fossils was a surface hunter, warm-blooded for speed. But if it survived extinction, adaptation would have rewritten it completely. Scales thickened to resist crushing depths. Eyes degenerated into pale orbs sensitive to faint vibrations. Flesh dense with oil to balance pressure. The predator would have become something quieter, more deliberate, the perfect shadow. And maybe it doesn't need to feed often. A whale carcass could sustain it for months. In the deep, energy is currency. Life waits still until something dies above and drifts down. The scientists call that the rain of death, the constant fall of remains from the upper ocean. For something as large as the Megalodon once was, patience would be survival itself. The Japanese research submersible, Shinkai 6500, once recorded an acoustic anomaly while surveying near the Kuril-Kamchatka Trench. A sound that lasted 27 minutes, low and pulsing, gradually rising in amplitude before cutting off abruptly. When cross-referenced, the same pattern appeared on U.S. Navy hydrophones 400 kilometers away. The source, if biological, would have been the size of a small island. The data was marked classified for review. No review was ever published. Sometimes I wonder if the ocean edits its own records. Every instrument we lower below 10,000 feet becomes unreliable. Pressure distorts metal, salt corrodes wires, and strange magnetics interfere with compasses. When we lose contact, we call it equipment failure. But perhaps the word failure disguises another truth, that the abyss simply rejects intrusion. There's a word marine biologists use when the data doesn't match the model. Outlier. It's a gentle word. Safe. Tidy. But the outliers are where the truth hides. In the deep, outliers multiply. Temperature inversions, pressure plateaus, echoes that sound alive. These anomalies gather around certain points, undersea ridges, methane vents, dead zones where sonar returns nothing but static, as if something there consumes not just life, but information itself. Imagine something moving that doesn't disturb the water. Something whose density equals the sea, invisible even to sonar, because it's part of the pressure itself. That's not fantasy. That's physics. possible if the tissue density matches the surrounding medium. A creature that swims without displacement. A ghost of muscle and oil. Its presence detectable only through what goes missing. Echoes, signals, certainty. Somewhere near the Tonga Trench, a cable-laying ship once reported a sudden increase in tension, followed by a deep jolt, as if the line had snagged on something alive. When they reeled it back, the titanium sheath was scored with parallel gouges, 4 centimeters deep, spaced like teeth. The official explanation blamed an anchor drag. But no anchor leaves patterns that regular. Maybe all of this is just noise. The ocean generates coincidences by the thousands each day. But the deeper you descend, the more coincidence starts to look like design. It's strange, isn't it? We send probes to the edge of the solar system, yet our own planet remains half-imagined. The sea floor is as alien as Europa or Titan, a world sealed by pressure instead of ice. And if something colossal survived down there, would it be any more unbelievable than the fact that life began in those same black waters billions of years ago? When the hydrophones fall silent between recordings, sometimes they catch faint, rhythmic tremors. Not earthquakes, not tectonic noise. Something slower, heavier, with a frequency just below human hearing. Like the beating of a colossal heart. If that's only coincidence, then it's the most patient coincidence on Earth. The ocean doesn't lie. It only withholds. And perhaps that's why we keep listening. Not because we expect an answer, but because deep down, some part of us recognizes the voice that waits below. In the black zone, everything dissolves except movement. And somewhere in that darkness, where water folds over itself like sleep, something still moves. Too slow to be measured, too large to be forgotten. It doesn't need to be found. It only needs to keep existing just beyond belief. For centuries, the sailors told stories they weren't supposed to. They spoke of nights when the sea went quiet, when every wave froze mid-motion, as if something immense passed beneath. They called it the shadow tide, a darkness that swallowed the moonlight and left behind no wake, no sound, just the memory of a shape moving under the hull. Captains dismissed it as superstition, a trick of nerves and waves. But those who spent their lives at sea knew better. The ocean has moods, and sometimes it remembers things that land has forgotten. Whaling logs from the 1800s still record strange encounters, written in trembling cursive by men who didn't yet know what could or couldn't exist. In 1852, the Star of Adelaide reported a great creature with a dorsal height like a cliff, sighted in the South Pacific, vanishing beneath a distressed pod of whales. The captain, Thomas Newell, described it as a living shoal of shadow, longer than his ship. He was ridiculed in port. Yet 2 months later, another vessel, the Clarion, logged an almost identical event near the same coordinates, this time with the sea-stained red and a single, enormous fin drifting for hours before sinking. The specimen was never recovered. The age of exploration turned into the age of denial. Science began to tidy up the world, naming every corner, closing every myth. But the sea does not submit to definition. Even now, maritime archives hide classified reports from the early 20th century. Sonar contacts recorded by the first submarines. Movements that mimicked whales but exceeded their speed. During World War II, the German U-boat U-5113 reported unidentified biological displacement while patrolling off the coast of Brazil. The sonar operator described it as a moving mountain of flesh. The contact followed them for 20 minutes, then vanished into depths the instruments couldn't reach. Later, when Allied navies analyzed the logs, they dismissed the report as a malfunction, though the same anomaly appeared in British and Japanese records months apart. different oceans, same shadow. During the Cold War, the paranoia of surveillance extended even to the sea. Military hydrophones lined the Pacific to detect submarines, but sometimes they caught things that weren't supposed to move. In 1963, the U.S. Navy recorded a low-frequency signal traveling thousands of kilometers in minutes. Classified under the code name Whale Alpha, it was believed at first to be an experimental Soviet sub. But its pattern was organic, rising, falling, pulsing. Marine biologist Dr. Bernard Heuvelmans later obtained fragments of the audio through an anonymous contact, describing it as a breathing too large for the world. The recording has since vanished from public archives. By then, the legends had already begun to resurface among the sailors. The return of the black fin, the great sleeper, the leviathan that forgot to die. Each name different, but each whispering of the same idea, that the sea kept one secret for itself. The fishermen off the coast of Chile spoke of whales that disappeared mid-migration, their sonar signatures swallowed whole. South African divers found whale carcasses with circular wounds larger than any known bite radius. And somewhere near the Mariana Islands, a cargo ship radioed a distress call that ended mid-sentence, followed by a single, echoing sound, a low, rolling boom that sonar analysts later described as biological but disproportionate. Of course, it's easy to explain everything away. Pressure anomalies, echo confusion, equipment failure. The ocean provides plausible deniability for every terror. But denial has its own sound. A quiet, too deliberate, too controlled. The kind of silence that only happens when something is being hidden. There are archives in London, Paris, and Sydney that still keep sealed logs from 19th century expeditions. Not for secrecy, but to preserve historical integrity. Yet among the scholars who have seen them, there are whispers, notes describing ships found adrift, crew missing, hulls bitten clean through like fruit, reports labeled inconclusive but written in the ink of fear. The Megalodon, if it survived, would not roam where we expect. It would haunt the liminal zones, where the continental shelf drops into darkness, where currents converge in silence. There are ancient corridors of cold water running beneath the equator, invisible rivers that cross oceans without surfacing. Whales follow them. So did the great predators. Perhaps they still do. In 2003, an Australian marine vessel deployed a satellite tag on a healthy great white shark off the coast of Western Australia. 4 months later, the tag washed ashore, showing data that made no sense. The shark's recorded temperature spiked by 20 degrees, then descended to depths of nearly 2 kilometers at a speed beyond any known fish. The official explanation: it was eaten by a larger animal. But no known predator fits the thermal and depth profile. The case was archived under unknown predation event. The press called it the shark that got eaten. If the ocean is a kind of memory, then stories like these are its fragments, flashes of something real buried under disbelief. We call them myths because it's easier to sleep that way. But myths are often the fossils of truth, worn smooth by time and fear. Some of the oldest Polynesian oral traditions speak of Kamoana Nui, the sleeping sea god, who once fed on whales but withdrew into darkness when the first humans arrived. The fishermen of Tahiti still refuse to fish certain trenches, saying, "The sea has its own ghosts." In the language of the deep, every superstition is a warning softened by poetry. And maybe the sailors, the whalers, the sonar operators, maybe they weren't mistaken. Maybe they just lacked the permission to be believed. History is written by those who surface, not by those who sink. In every story, there's a moment when disbelief begins to crack. For some, it's a sighting. For others, a sound. But for the sea, it's always a feeling. That subtle vibration beneath the hull, the hum in the bone that says something vast is moving below. When the modern world looks back on these accounts, it laughs. We call it pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find patterns in chaos. But what if the pattern is real, and it's the chaos that's the illusion? The sea has always been patient. It lets us forget, then reminds us slowly in the language of anomalies and echoes. And as ships grow quieter, as sonar grows sharper, something down there must know that we're listening again. Perhaps it listens too. Maybe that's what the sailors meant when they said the ocean watches. They didn't mean superstition. They meant memory, an ancient consciousness beneath pressure, one that knows the shape of our fear. Because sometimes, when the moon is low and the tide is still, the water reflects not the sky, but the abyss itself. And if you stare long enough, the reflection stares back. In 1959, a carcass washed ashore on the beach of Oshima Island, Japan. It was bloated, headless, and almost unrecognizable. The fishermen who found it thought it was a decaying whale at first, until they saw the cartilage. It was not bone. It was fibrous, translucent, like the framework of a shark magnified beyond sense. The creature measured more than 30 feet, and its flesh was laced with traces of ammonia, a chemical defense typical of deep-sea species. Scientists called it a globster, a word that means nothing but hides discomfort well. Samples were taken, photographed, analyzed. A few months later, the remains vanished before any formal identification. The official explanation: misclassification, likely a basking shark. But even basking sharks have limits, and that carcass exceeded them all. Incidents like that are cataloged quietly across decades. In 1969, Chilean fishermen pulled from the water a shredded whale flank with bite marks almost half a meter apart. The tissue around the wounds was not torn but crushed, pulverized, as if caught between jaws designed to snap bone. A marine biologist who studied the photos said something few dared to repeat. If the Megalodon had survived, this is what its feeding would look like. The photos disappeared into private archives. The biologist retired soon after. Science demands proof. But proof in the ocean is a fragile thing. Salt, pressure, and time erase evidence faster than we can record it. What remains are fragments. A tooth too sharp, a wound too wide, a sound too deep. Clues that don't fit comfortably in our taxonomy. And so we rename them, reclassify, rationalize. Because it's easier to edit the story than to rewrite the map. Marine cryptozoologists, those few who still chase forbidden hypotheses, collect these reports like sacred relics. Each file, each sonar trace, each forgotten cable log. Among them is a peculiar case from 1978. The Soviet vessel Vityaz recorded a deep-water anomaly while mapping the coral basin. The sonar returned a faint echo of an immense moving object, nearly 30 meters long, pacing the ship for 6 minutes before fading into the trench. When the data was reviewed, the official record marked it as whale aggregation interference. Yet the echo's density signature didn't match organic mass. It matched cartilage. Then came 1980, when a group of U.S. marine researchers deployed a whale carcass off Hawaii to study scavenger patterns. Cameras were set to record for 48 hours. The feed lasted only 19. The carcass vanished in a single bite, the tether cable cut clean. The team retrieved the device later, metal twisted, lens shattered, housing imprinted with parallel scratches wider than a diver's palm. The footage that survived showed only the shadow of something immense moving across the frame, blotting out the camera's light like an eclipse. It moved with purpose, slowly, quietly, as if aware of being seen. There are no official papers about that experiment. Only a handful of scientists still alive who mention it in passing, always off record. They speak as if discussing a ghost story, a memory that doesn't want to be remembered, and yet traces of those same wounds keep resurfacing. In 2003, an adult blue whale stranded near Perth bore semicircular bite scars matching no known predator. The spacing, 32 centimeters. The estimated jaw width, 2 meters. Even great whites can't reach half that. The autopsy concluded unknown trauma from industrial debris. But there was no debris. No collision marks. Only crushing. The kind of pressure that doesn't come from machines, but from something alive. The ocean is a place where evidence dissolves into myth and myth into science. Between them lies a zone of gray, a fog where truth and imagination breathe the same salt air. Every carcass that washes ashore carries that fog with it. A faint smell of something unfinished. Sometimes I wonder whether we need the Megalodon more than the ocean does. A creature that embodies the ungovernable, the part of nature that refuses our control. Perhaps that's why we keep resurrecting it in stories and films. To make it visible again. To shrink it down to scale. To pretend we could defeat it. Because to admit it might still live is to accept that we never really ruled the sea at all. But nature doesn't care for our hierarchy. In its language, extinction is not a period. It's a pause. A breathing space between appearances. The fossil record shows that large marine predators vanish, then return in altered forms. The coelacanth was the first to humiliate our certainty. Thought gone since the Cretaceous, it was found alive, slow-moving, luminous, utterly indifferent to our surprise. Then came the rediscovery of the giant squid, a creature once ridiculed as sailors' fantasy, now measured in laboratories. What else waits beneath, unbothered by extinction's declaration? When oceanographers say 95% of the deep remains unexplored, they're not exaggerating. The abyssal plains stretch for hundreds of millions of square kilometers, a world larger than all continents combined, wrapped in darkness and pressure. We send our technology into that blackness and call it exploration. But what if it's closer to intrusion? Some sonar operators swear they've tracked shapes larger than any whale, moving with impossible grace. They whisper about false pings that aren't false at all, about returns that fade when approached, as if the sea itself hides them. These aren't men prone to fantasy. They spend years listening to the language of water. When they fall silent mid-sentence, staring at the depth monitor, you know they've heard something real, something they'll never be able to prove. And proof, perhaps, is the wrong pursuit. What the Megalodon represents isn't just a species. It's the idea that we've mistaken the ocean's patience for emptiness. It teaches that disappearance doesn't equal death, that survival can take forms we no longer recognize. Maybe the Megalodon doesn't look like it once did. Maybe it's smaller, colder, translucent, adapted to an eternal night. Maybe it doesn't need to breathe as we understand it. There's a theory among some marine biologists that deep-sea gigantism, the tendency for species to grow larger with depth, is not just adaptation, but echo. The ocean remembers its former shapes. The pressure preserves them, repeats them, grows them again from fragments of memory encoded in DNA and environment. The Megalodon might not have survived as an individual species, but as a template. A recurring dream in the genetic archive of the sea. We're taught that extinction is clean, that nature erases perfectly. But nature is messy. It blurs. It forgets slowly. Perhaps that's why, every few years, another mysterious carcass washes up somewhere. And we rush to label it basking shark, whale remnant, decomposition artifact. Each explanation a shield against the impossible. But what if the impossible is only what we refuse to reimagine? The last time a globster appeared, in 2018, it was on a Philippine shore. A vast pale mass, rubbery and fibrous, with the faint ammonia scent again. Samples were taken. The official verdict was rotted whale tissue, the same verdict we give everything that doesn't fit. But the fishermen who saw it said it came from the sea still warm, still dripping, still breathing faintly. They said the waves broke differently that night, as if something beneath had exhaled. Maybe that's all the Megalodon ever needed to survive. Our disbelief. Because nothing hides better than what we've already decided is gone. And as long as we keep declaring it extinct, the ocean has no reason to correct us. In 1997, the ocean spoke, and no one was ready to listen. Somewhere off the coast of South America, a low-frequency sound rippled through the Pacific, captured by hydrophones thousands of kilometers apart. It rose and fell like the echo of a living heartbeat, so loud it could be heard from the equator to Antarctica. Scientists called it the bloop. For years, it haunted the imagination of everyone who worked in deep-sea acoustics. It wasn't machinery. It wasn't seismic activity. The frequency curve looked organic, eerily similar to the vocal patterns of blue whales, yet at least 6 times louder. That meant whatever made it was larger than any animal known to science. At first, researchers joked that it must be the call of a super whale, something born of myth and error. Later, NOAA reclassified it as the sound of shifting ice shelves, the groan of glaciers breaking apart in the southern oceans. But even among oceanographers, that explanation has always felt rehearsed. Ice doesn't pulse like that. Ice doesn't breathe. There are other sounds like the bloop, lesser known, more carefully hidden. Julia, recorded in 1999, lasted almost 15 minutes, its resonance echoing from the direction of Antarctica. Then, slow down, a dragging, mournful vibration traveling hundreds of miles across the sea. Train. A mechanical rhythmic moan that analysts couldn't trace to any geological source. Each of these signals appeared once, briefly, then never again. Each one behaved as if it came from something moving. The official stance is that they're all ice quakes. But the ocean is older than glaciers, and the sound it makes when it dreams is older still. Deep in the archives of the U.S. Navy's hydrophone network, originally built to track submarines during the Cold War, there are hundreds of recordings labeled unidentified biological. Most are never released. The frequencies fall below the range of human hearing, meant to be read only as data. But those who've analyzed them describe strange consistencies, intervals resembling respiration, regular surges like muscle movement, faint harmonics suggesting vast internal chambers resonating through liquid. When translated to sound waves audible to the human ear, the effect is haunting, like a distant breath echoing through a cathedral. A whale song stretched across the abyss, but too deep, too steady, too deliberate. One acoustic specialist once said, "If the ocean had lungs, this is what they'd sound like." What if that's not metaphor? Some scientists now suggest that life in the deep sea may evolve towards silence, that the larger a creature becomes, the less it needs to make sound. Yet, paradoxically, the ocean keeps giving us these moments of thunder, the sudden, impossible roar of something vast breaking its quiet. It's as though something down there occasionally stirs, exhales, then sinks back into stillness for another century. We used to think of the ocean as a wilderness, an open expanse. But in reality, it's an archive, a layered structure of sound and memory. Every echo, every hum, every vibration is recorded somewhere within its density. To listen to it is to eavesdrop on the planet itself. In 2015, A team of marine physicists studying sound shadows, regions where underwater acoustics bend and vanish, found a zone beneath the Philippine Sea where all signals drop to zero. No reflection, no absorption, just void. They called it the silent floor. When they sent down a drone, its sensors malfunctioned within minutes. Its camera went black. The pressure readings fluctuated as if the machine were inside something moving. The data ended abruptly, replaced by static that sounded when amplified like a slow heartbeat. No one has gone back since. The funding was redirected. The report reclassified as inconclusive. It's easier to believe in broken instruments than in the possibility that something else is listening. Some of the strangest evidence for the Megalodon's potential survival comes not from vision, but from sound. In several deep ocean recordings taken near feeding grounds of sperm whales, hydrophones have picked up brief, low-frequency clicks below the known vocal range of any cetacean. These clicks follow pods of whales for days, then vanish after the whales scatter in panic. When played at normal speed, the sound resembles the creak of shifting steel, but with a rhythm unmistakably organic. To hear it is to feel watched. And then there are the whale carcasses, enormous bodies found floating or sinking, marked not by decay, but by blunt trauma, as if crushed. In 2014, near the Azores, an autonomous glider recorded vibrations consistent with an attack. The pattern showed 3 bursts of force, separated by intervals of 30 seconds, almost like a feeding strike. The water clouded with blood. By the time a recovery vessel arrived, the carcass had sunk beyond reach. Of course, scientists labeled it as predation by an unknown shark. But the depth, 1,200 meters, exceeds the known range of any great white. Perhaps what we're hearing in these recordings isn't a creature at all, but the echo of the ocean remembering one. Sound travels differently in salt water. It can persist for centuries, bouncing off thermal layers, looping through trenches. A single event might resonate endlessly, distorted until it sounds like something alive. But if that's true, why do the patterns change? Why do new ones appear? Why do they follow migration paths that only living predators would know? Maybe the Megalodon is no longer a species but a frequency. A recurring note in the music of the deep. A biological presence that speaks through the medium of sound itself. In 2019, a research vessel near the Kermadec Trench recorded an ultra-low tone lasting 53 seconds. It began as a vibration, then rose slowly until it became audible, before cutting off mid-pulse. The waveform resembled the bloop, but smaller, like an offspring of the same voice. It came from a depth of nearly 8,000 meters. The recording is known only by its code, Event 419. It was archived quietly, overshadowed by other projects, but those who've heard it describe the same sensation, that faint pressure in the chest, the illusion of something enormous moving just beyond hearing. Perhaps the deep sea doesn't hide life. Perhaps it sustains it through sound. Pressure and vibration, the 2 oldest forms of communication on Earth, shaping and reshaping existence. Maybe the Megalodon survived not through flesh, but through resonance, passing itself into the fabric of the ocean. It would make sense, wouldn't it, that something so massive, so ancient, could dissolve into the very element that birthed it, becoming not a body, but a presence. And sometimes, when the water is still enough, the instruments pick up faint harmonics again, the same rhythm as before, the same heartbeat. We mark it on our graphs, label it unknown biological source, then move on. But in those quiet seconds before the next signal arrives, the ocean sounds almost human, like something breathing beneath its own memory. And perhaps that is all the proof we'll ever get. Not a carcass, not a photograph, just the pulse of a silence too vast to name. Every fossil is a memory written in mineral. Each tooth, each vertebra, each fragment of enamel carries a whisper from the body that once lived inside it. For centuries, we've treated fossils as dead matter, records of what no longer is. But under a microscope, even silence has texture. Proteins, collagen strands, trace elements of DNA, echoes that outlast flesh. The deeper scientists look, the more they find the past refusing to stay buried. In 2019, a group of molecular paleobiologists at the University of Copenhagen announced they had isolated preserved proteins from a 15-million-year-old Megalodon tooth. It shouldn't have been possible. Under normal conditions, protein chains decay completely within 4 million years. Yet there it was, faint, incomplete, but undeniably biological. The discovery shook the field for a few days before being dismissed as cross-contamination. But that word has become a ritual, the scientific version of a prayer used whenever data misbehaves. Still, whispers of something more persisted. The team's lead researcher, Dr. Amara Lewin, later hinted in a conference paper that the peptide sequence bore resemblance to modern lamniform sharks, but with mutations suggesting recent, unrecorded divergence. When pressed, she simply said, "Some lineages die in theory before they die in practice." It's an unsettling thought. That extinction could be statistical, not absolute. That somewhere, a lineage keeps breathing while the fossil record stops counting. Ancient DNA retrieval has become a kind of necromancy, the summoning of ghosts through molecules. But the ocean resists such rituals. Salt destroys nucleotides, pressure crushes them, time scrambles them beyond repair. Yet in deep-sea sediments, where oxygen cannot reach, preservation takes on a strange grace. Organic matter lingers. Microfossils remain intact. Even the faintest trace of protein can become a key. Several laboratories have now quietly joined what they call Project Abyssal Genome, an attempt to reconstruct genetic sequences from marine fossils buried beneath the continental slopes. Their work is slow, secretive, haunted by contamination scares. But in one unpublished report from 2022, a section of sequencing returned an anomaly, a fragment of mitochondrial DNA similar to Carcharodon species, but with deletions unseen in any known shark. It was labeled Sample 44M, Origin, Pacific Subduction Core, 8000 done. When one of the junior researchers leaked the result online, it vanished within hours. The post was scrubbed, the account deleted. Later, the official statement clarified it was a misread barcode. But those who worked on the project told a different story, that the fragment wasn't a misread at all. It was incomplete, yes, but real. A gene belonging to something too large, too ancient, and too recent to fit. If the Megalodon's genetic signature still lingers in the ocean floor, then perhaps extinction is not a disappearance, but a diffusion, a dissolving of lineage into the greater body of the sea. DNA does not simply die, it travels. It rides currents in plankton, settles in sediments, hides in the digestive tracts of scavengers. The ocean is a circulatory system of memory, recycling the codes of what once lived into what will live again. And sometimes the pattern repeats. Consider the coelacanth's genome, unchanged for 400 million years, almost identical to its fossil ancestors. Or the Greenland shark, capable of living 4 centuries in freezing blackness. Life does not always obey the timeline of extinction. Sometimes it folds back on itself, preserving what should have ended. Perhaps the Megalodon story followed that same quiet curve. Not a resurrection, but a persistence. The idea unsettles evolutionary biologists because it violates the narrative of progress. Evolution is supposed to move forward, not in circles. But the ocean does not care for progress. It prefers cycles, creation and forgetting, hunger and stillness, pressure and release. It erases and rewrites endlessly, like a tide smoothing words from sand. If a creature once adapted to the open, warm seas of the Miocene found refuge in the cold abyss, its body would not vanish, it would transform. Its descendants might not look like the monsters of our imagination. They might be slower, translucent, boneless shapes that barely resemble sharks at all. But the genetic echo would remain. The ocean does not discard its blueprints. There is something poetic and terrifying about that continuity. That a strand of code written millions of years ago might still drift through seawater, invisible but alive. It would mean that extinction is a myth we tell to reassure ourselves that endings are final. In one of her interviews, Dr. Lewin said, "DNA is a form of dreaming. Every molecule remembers a shape it once wore. If that is true, then perhaps the ocean dreams of teeth. Wide, triangular, perfect." The Megalodon may not be a creature anymore, but a recurring dream inside evolution's subconscious, waiting for the right conditions to reassemble. And the conditions are changing again. The deep seas are warming. Nutrient flows are shifting. Species once confined to mid-water zones now drift into trenches. New ecosystems bloom around methane vents. What if these changes awaken something dormant? A genetic command long asleep in the dark. Not rebirth, but reactivation. When scientists map the genomes of modern great whites, they find strange redundancies, silent sequences that serve no purpose, relics of something older. Some researchers call them ghost genes. Others, more poetically, call them the shadow code. These inactive strands, they say, could be reawakened under stress or mutation, triggering ancient traits. Faster growth, denser cartilage, colder metabolism. Evolution repeating an old melody in a different octave. Perhaps the Megalodon never truly died. It simply fell silent in our perception, its genetic song reduced to background noise. And now, as the oceans change, that song might be rising again. Faint, irregular, but familiar. The real mystery isn't whether we can find the creature. It's whether we'll recognize it when we do. It may not look like the fossil in the museum. It may not look like a shark at all. It may be something that evolved inward. Pure instinct, pure memory, pure hunger, condensed into form. One night, in a remote Norwegian lab, a technician reported hearing low thuds from the deep-sea tanks that held extracted sediment samples. The sensors picked up faint vibrations, regular, rhythmic, like breathing. When they checked, the temperature of the samples had risen by a fraction of a degree. They dismissed it as equipment fault. But the data remains. A pulse in the dark, recorded, unexplained. Maybe DNA doesn't just remember life. Maybe it misses it. And in the infinite patience of the sea, longing is enough. The code waits. The water hums. The past rehearses itself quietly until the world above grows ready to believe again. Perhaps that's how life returns. Not with a roar, but with a whisper from the sediments. A single cell unfolding an ancient hunger, a molecule remembering the shape of a fin. And when it happens, it won't be rebirth. It will be recognition. The ocean remembering what it never meant to forget. There is a strange rhythm to the planet's warmth. Every few million years, the sea exhales, the currents shift, and life rearranges itself in ways that seem both random and deliberate. To most, climate change is a modern crisis, an invention of our industrial age. But to the ocean, it is simply another heartbeat, another oscillation in a long series of forgotten transformations. And every pulse of warmth brings something back. During the late Pliocene, When the Megalodon is said to have vanished, global temperatures fell, and the ocean's upper layers cooled enough to drive its prey, whales, seals, and warm-blooded fish, toward the equator. The giant shark, adapted for tropical seas, supposedly followed them until the cold overtook it. But the fossil record doesn't tell us how quickly that cold descended, nor does it tell us what survived beneath it. The story of extinction may simply be a story told from the wrong depth. Beneath the thermocline, the layer where sunlight dies and temperature plummets, lies another ocean entirely. The water there is dense, ancient, almost static. It circulates not in years, but in millennia, moving like the slow breath of a sleeping god. Scientists call it the abyssal current, a conveyor of cold that sweeps through every trench on Earth. It is the only truly global ocean, connecting all seas in silence. What if the Megalodon didn't die with the surface warmth? What if it followed that current downward, retreating from extinction into the cold veins of the planet? The coelacanth did something similar. As the world changed, it sank into deeper, darker habitats where the pressure preserved it. Its metabolism slowed, its body hardened, and it endured. For 60 million years, it hid beneath the noise of evolution. Until one day, we caught one and realized that the fossil record had been lying to us out of ignorance, not malice. The same might be true for other ancient creatures. In 2021, divers off the coast of Japan found a frilled shark, a species thought extinct since the age of dinosaurs, still alive, still coiled like a serpent in the black water. And in the Arctic, scientists recently discovered microbial colonies frozen for 30,000 years that began metabolizing again once warmed. Life, it seems, does not die easily. It simply waits for the climate to remember it. Oceanographers studying abyssal migration patterns have long noticed something curious. Large pelagic animals are moving deeper, not just horizontally. As the surface warms, fish, whales, and even giant squid descend hundreds of meters each decade, following cold refuge zones. It's a mass migration downward, slow, invisible, unstoppable. The ocean is folding in on itself. And if its prey are retreating into the dark, what follows them? Somewhere beneath the Antarctic circumpolar current lies a trench system so remote that no human submersible has reached it. Satellites record subtle gravitational anomalies, dense, moving clusters of mass that rise and fall with seasonal oscillations. At first, scientists thought it was glacial water movement. But glacial water doesn't move in circles. It doesn't hunt. The data fits something else. Something vast, mobile, and alive. We forget that the Megalodon wasn't just a predator. It was an apex regulator, a sculptor of marine balance. When it vanished, whale populations exploded, followed by cascading shifts in ocean chemistry. Some paleoceanographers argue that its absence may have triggered an ecological collapse still echoing today, a subtle chain of imbalance that made the seas more fragile. If a creature like that ever returns, it wouldn't just re-enter an ecosystem, it would reclaim an ancient role. The ocean might even be asking for it. Deep-sea currents are changing. As polar ice melts, cold brine flows faster along the abyssal corridors, revitalizing areas once stagnant for centuries. Nutrients buried in silt rise into circulation again. In those dark plains, new life blooms, bacteria, crustaceans, gelatinous feeders. It's as if the seafloor is awakening from hibernation, and with it, the conditions that once nurtured giants may be reassembling. Biologists studying these trenches report sonar readings of large biological clusters, moving with thermocline fluctuations. Massive, slow drifting forms that rise and descend with precision, as if tracking prey. The signals appear seasonally, then vanish. Some compare them to baleen whales, others to deep-sea jelly aggregations. But one researcher, speaking anonymously, said, "The density is too high. It's something with muscle. Theories abound, but most go unpublished. No one wants to lose funding chasing myths." Yet quietly, a few data scientists in Monaco have begun plotting correlations between sea surface temperature anomalies and unidentified sonar events. The result is uncanny. Every major thermal spike coincides with a rise in deep anomaly activity, as though the warmth above stirs something sleeping below. Maybe extinction is not a moment, but a rhythm. And some species know the beat better than we do. When night falls over the Southern Ocean, satellites capture bioluminescent blooms spreading across the black like drifting galaxies. Plankton responding to invisible cues, pulses of current, vibrations, unseen predators, light answering darkness. One marine ecologist watching the footage remarked, half joking, "It's as if the ocean is signaling something back." Perhaps it is. In a 2017 study of abyssal predators, a Norwegian expedition detected unusual electromagnetic fields emanating from deep currents. The team assumed geological origin, moving metal-rich sediments, but further analysis showed irregular pulsation, consistent with biological origin. The field was enormous, spanning several kilometers. Whatever produced it carried its own current, its own subtle electrical hum. Sharks, even modern ones, use electroreception to navigate and hunt. They read the world through electricity, sensing the heartbeat of everything alive. Imagine that ability magnified through eons of adaptation. A creature that no longer needs eyes, that moves through fields of magnetism and current as if swimming through thought itself. It would perceive not just motion, but intention. It would know when it's being watched. If the Megalodon, or something descended from it, survived, it may no longer be a hunter in the way we understand. It may be part of the ocean's nervous system itself, an extension of its sensing field, a moving organ within a larger planetary body. We like to think extinction means absence, but the sea teaches the opposite. Disappearance can also mean transformation. The predator becomes the current, the tooth becomes the stone, the memory becomes the sound. And if the warming seas are truly waking old circuits of life, then what rises next may not look like a monster at all, just another shape in the dark, following the oldest instruction written into salt and time: endure. One day, our instruments will record a movement that does not fit the model, a pulse that travels faster than current, slower than sound. They will name it anomaly, interference, perhaps nothing at all. But those who listen long enough will know the truth. The ocean has begun remembering, and what it remembers is hungry. There is a phrase marine technicians use when sonar returns shapes too large, too perfect, too close to belief: cryptic shadows. It's a polite way of saying something we can't explain. The ocean produces many illusions, mirages of sound, distortions of scale. But some shadows linger. They move with intention. They return. In 2005, a deep-sea exploration project near the Puerto Rico Trench recorded a sonar contact at a depth of 7,800 meters. The object measured more than 25 meters long, with a curvature identical to a living spine. The operators assumed it was a whale until it turned. The speed, the precision, the arc of motion. It wasn't drifting. It was responding. When the vessel adjusted its course, the shadow mirrored it for 12 seconds, then sank into the black below. The data logs showed a pressure disturbance consistent with a living mass several hundred tons in weight. The footage was never made public. The official summary reads only, "Transient noise interference. The deeper we look, the more that interference begins to resemble life. Every sonar ping is a question, and the sea sometimes answers. But the answers rarely make sense. In the past decade, oceanographers have cataloged hundreds of unidentified submersible targets, USTs, that move faster than whales but slower than machines, with temperature signatures too cold for mammals. They leave no trail, no reflection. Only the faint wake of something enormous passing just beyond the edge of certainty. Skeptics point to sonar artifacts, the tricks of echo and current that create phantom bodies. And sometimes, yes, it's only the sea playing with sound, but not always. Because sometimes, the same artifact reappears in the same trench, months or years apart, as if returning on migration. In 2011, a Japanese drone sub patrolling near the Bonin Islands picked up a heat bloom deep under the slope. A sudden pulse of warmth, elliptical, 30 meters across. The bloom lasted 20 seconds, then vanished. 2 hours later, it appeared again, 30 kilometers away. The shape tracked through the thermocline as if rising and falling with lungs. Whatever it was, it moved like a living system. Marine biologist Kenji Ito called it a biological ghost. He believed it was an organism so well adapted to the abyss that it could manipulate its own temperature to blend with surrounding currents. A perfect predator of the deep, seen only when it chose to be. His paper was rejected for lack of evidence. He withdrew from academia 2 years later. Some say he still dives alone off Okinawa, following sonar echoes no one else will listen to. Science depends on visibility, yet 95% of the ocean remains unseen. Maybe that's why cryptic shadows provoke such unease. They remind us how small our evidence is, how fragile the boundary between knowledge and darkness has always been. There are archived submarine logs from the 1970s that speak of living silhouettes crossing sonar range. Classified at the time, declassified decades later. One U.S. Navy report describes an encounter in the Philippine Trench. An acoustic mass the size of a destroyer, following a sub for nearly half an hour. The sonar officer noted rhythmic pulsations, suggestive of respiration. The commander ordered silence. No pursuit, no report, only a note in the margin. Contact dissolved into depth. It's easy to imagine paranoia in those details. But sonar doesn't lie. The signals were real, and what they described doesn't fit any known life. A few independent researchers, hobbyists, rogue data analysts, retired ocean engineers now collect these anomalies. They overlay them on global maps of temperature, migration, seismicity. Patterns emerge. Certain coordinates repeat: the Tonga Trench, the Puerto Rico Trench, the Kermadec Ridge, the Antarctic Basin, each a gateway into cold darkness, each pulsing with occasional, unaccountable motion. The deeper question isn't whether something is down there, it's why it hides so perfectly. One possibility is biological intelligence, not in the human sense, but in the evolutionary one. The longer a species survives, the better it learns to avoid us. Some paleontologists suspect that truly ancient lineages don't vanish. They evolve into invisibility. Survival, at its purest, is camouflage. For a creature that once ruled the surface, retreating into silence might be its final adaptation. But there's another possibility, one that unsettles even the scientists who whisper it. What if the ocean itself learned to disguise its own life? Pressure alters matter in ways we barely understand. At 10,000 meters, water behaves like a liquid crystal, dense, almost sentient in its structure. Sound waves don't simply travel through it. They bend, refract, fold upon themselves. Under those conditions, a living being could merge with its environment completely. Both body and element, echo and current. Not separate from the ocean, but an organ within it. If the Megalodon's descendants have endured, perhaps they no longer exist as individuals at all. Perhaps they've become a collective, a dispersed awareness across the deep, each body a fleeting manifestation of the same enduring will. A consciousness that sleeps in pressure and wakes when the temperature changes. It's a thought that frightens most scientists into laughter. But in private, a few admit they've considered it. One acoustician once said, "Sometimes when I analyze the deep recordings, I feel as though the ocean is aware of me analyzing it." In 2018, a French vessel mapping the mid-Atlantic ridge picked up a sonar reflection shaped like a jaw. Enormous, symmetrical, tapering at both ends. The technicians thought it was a joke, a glitch. Then the reflection closed, slowly, around the vessel's descending probe. The tension cables snapped. The camera feed went black. On the final frame before the signal cut out, a brief pattern of parallel ridges was visible. The curve of something serrated. The image was never published. The captain's final entry in the log read, "The sea blinked." We treat such accounts as superstition because they sound like it. But superstition is only fear dressed in ritual. And fear often knows what facts refuse to name. To some, these stories confirm the myth that the Megalodon still roams, invisible, patient, waiting. To others, they speak to something deeper, that the sea itself is sentient in ways we don't yet comprehend, and that what we call shadows are only the edges of that sentience brushing against us. Either way, the effect is the same. When the sonar hums and the monitors light up, and the technicians lean forward to see a shape that cannot be there, the human mind flickers between awe and dread. We are reminded that observation itself is a fragile privilege, because maybe the Megalodon no longer needs to be seen to exist. Maybe being unseen is the final stage of evolution, invisibility as perfection. And if that's true, then every shadow beneath our ships is more than absence. It's presence choosing silence. Some nights, when the seas are still and the sonar quiets, crews swear they can feel a slow pulse under the hull. Not a wave, not an engine, but something vast breathing beneath them. A heartbeat that doesn't belong to any machine. They don't talk about it afterward. The ocean has its ways of keeping secrets, and silence is the price of listening too closely. Beneath every coastline, the earth is still rewriting itself. The ocean floor moves like a slow dream, plates drifting, colliding, swallowing one another whole. What we call the fossil record is only a page left above water. The rest, the real story, lies folded under continents, sinking into the mantle where memory becomes molten. Every million years or so, an ocean dies, another is born, and the archives of life vanish beneath a new crust. It's not extinction. It's burial by design. The Megalodon's bones once rested on those shifting pages, continental shelves that now sleep beneath kilometers of sediment. If we could peel back the seafloor, we might find them there still, perfectly preserved, their teeth glinting like obsidian mirrors. But nature guards her past with pressure. The deeper we drill, the less the rock wants to remember. In 1972, a research ship drilling off the coast of Colombia retrieved a core sample from 1,400 meters below the seafloor. Inside it were fragments of fossilized cartilage embedded in ancient silt. The analysis identified the strata as Miocene, 15 million years old. Yet the collagen fibers were astonishingly intact. One paleontologist described them as the color of dried blood. The core was sent to a laboratory in Washington for further study. It never arrived. The official explanation: shipping loss. But a technician later claimed the sample was quietly seized by a government agency for biomaterial review. Sometimes it feels as though the deeper we dig, the faster our discoveries are buried again. The ocean's geology is alive, a circulatory system that constantly devours its own evidence. Where two tectonic plates meet, one slides beneath the other, pulling ancient fossils into the mantle. Over millions of years, the record of an entire ecosystem can disappear this way, ground down to magma and forgotten. But sometimes, that memory resurfaces. In the form of ophiolites, chunks of ocean crust thrust back up onto land. Those stones hold fossils older than extinction itself, glimpses of worlds we no longer remember. What if, among them, are traces of a species that refused to die? A few geologists have noticed something strange along certain coastal fault zones. The sudden appearance of teeth embedded in uplifted sediments that shouldn't contain them. In New Zealand's North Island, for instance, a fossil bed dated to the early Pleistocene revealed Megalodon teeth mixed with younger marine shells. The explanation was reworking, meaning the teeth had been displaced by currents or earthquakes. But the matrix surrounding them was unbroken. The strata didn't lie. The sea simply lifted something older into the present. It's as though the planet itself occasionally exhumes its own secrets. Not for us, but for itself. We forget that the Earth is not static. The continents move at the speed of fingernails. Yet over deep time, that's enough to erase whole civilizations of species. The ocean's bottom is a graveyard that keeps sinking, and each time it does, a new ocean forms above it. The Megalodon could have followed those migrations downward, riding the slow collapse of its home like a pilgrim descending into myth. Even now, the geological record shows that some parts of the seafloor are far younger than we imagine. Entire ridges formed within the last 2 million years, long after the Megalodon was supposed to vanish, which means that in Earth's hidden layers, new habitats could have formed from the ruins of old ones. Sanctuaries where time and temperature folded perfectly for survival. In 2008, seismologists mapping the Tonga subduction zone detected unexplained microquakes beneath the trench, consistent with moving mass rather than rock friction. The tremors were rhythmic, not the random stutter of tectonics, but a pattern, a pulse. Later models described them as cyclic slip events, perhaps the result of fluid migration. But fluids don't move with such precision. Something was shifting in those depths, not solid, not liquid, but alive. To understand what that means, you have to think like the Earth. Pressure does not destroy life, it transforms it. Every geological process we consider destructive, volcanism, subduction, faulting, creates heat gradients, chemical flows, habitats. The same fractures that swallow fossils also release nutrients, gases, warmth. The ocean's scars are where life regenerates. Maybe extinction and creation are not opposites, but phases of the same movement. The planet breathing through destruction. Somewhere within that breath, the Megalodon might have found continuity. It's not impossible to imagine a population of deep-dwelling sharks trapped in a basin sealed by tectonic uplift, adapting generation after generation until surface science forgot them. The ocean's geology is full of such traps, enclosed valleys, sinkholes, and basins that isolate species for millions of years. The coelacanth did exactly that. Why not something larger, colder, more patient? There are also strange coincidences in sediment data. Samples from the Peru-Chile Trench show periodic spikes in calcium phosphate, the mineral found in teeth and bone, every 300,000 years, far more than natural erosion can explain. Something with a skeleton the size of a submarine could account for such fluxes. The pattern suggests a cycle of die-off and renewal, as though a lineage keeps collapsing and re-emerging across epochs. But perhaps the most haunting evidence is not physical at all. When researchers run paleomagnetic scans of the seafloor, they sometimes find anomalies. patches where the magnetic alignment of minerals shifts suddenly, as if magnetized by moving mass instead of solid rock. These distortions repeat near ancient trenches, particularly those connected to fossil Megalodon sites. It's as if something with a magnetic field of its own once swam there, strong enough to write into stone. It's tempting to call that fantasy, but fantasy often begins as physics we haven't yet learned. If the ocean has a memory, the crust is its handwriting. Each fault line, each sediment layer, each lost trench is a page in an unending book, written not in ink, but in absence. The deeper we read, the more we find the same sentence repeating. Disappearance is not the same as death. We like to think the Megalodon vanished, but maybe the Earth simply turned the page. Perhaps that's why, in certain drill cores, a faint vibration sometimes lingers even after extraction, as though the rock itself hums quietly in its box, remembering pressure, remembering depth. Geologists call it acoustic relaxation. But it feels like something else. A heartbeat fossilized in stone. Every planet keeps its secrets. Mars hides water. Venus hides life. Earth hides time. And beneath all that, in the drowned libraries of the sea, something vast and patient waits for the next tectonic shift to lift it into our light again. Maybe that's what the tremors are. The ocean moving in its sleep, turning toward us. The Earth, restless, remembering. And somewhere under those restless plates, the bones of a creature older than extinction stir again, dreaming of an ocean that has never stopped being its home. Knowledge doesn't vanish on its own. It is erased, quietly, patiently, under the pretense of certainty. For every mystery that reaches the surface, there is an institution waiting to file it away, to rename the strange until it sounds familiar. The deeper the evidence sinks, the safer the world feels. That's how history maintains its order, through omission. The story of the Megalodon's extinction was never just about fossils. It was about control. In the late 19th century, natural science was building an empire of explanation. Every specimen cataloged, every anomaly labeled, every myth dissolved into data. To suggest that something colossal might still exist beyond reach was to invite chaos, to blur the line between the civilized and the wild. So when sailors brought back stories of monstrous fins and vanishing whales, scholars smiled politely and wrote them off as folklore. When strange carcasses washed ashore, they became whale decomposition artifacts. The phrase fossilized itself into textbooks. By the 1950s, marine biology had become an instrument of Cold War confidence, a science that mirrored the structure of its sponsors. Sonar networks, deep-sea expeditions, research grants, all funded by governments whose greatest fear was not the unknown, but the unmanageable. The ocean had to be mapped, measured, domesticated. Anything that refused to fit into that grid risked being classified or buried under paperwork. That's why certain sonar recordings never see daylight. The hydrophone archives are full of signals labeled unidentified biological, but few are released to the public. Not because they're fake, but because they're inconvenient. To acknowledge them would be to admit that 95% of the ocean is still ungoverned. And institutions do not like admitting what they cannot govern. There are stories among retired oceanographers, whispers of reports that vanished after peer review, of research vessels told to halt investigations for security reasons. One man, a sound analyst for the U.S. Navy in the 1970s, claimed that several deep-sea anomalies were deliberately misclassified as submarine interference to avoid public speculation. When he spoke about it decades later, he laughed softly. They were afraid of panic, he said, but I think they were more afraid of curiosity. Science, at its purest, is a form of curiosity. But once it intertwines with power, curiosity becomes selective. Funding dictates what questions are allowed, and some questions are simply too large. The Megalodon lingers at the intersection of those forbidden inquiries, a symbol of nature's autonomy, a reminder that the planet doesn't require our permission to conceal or reveal itself. To acknowledge the possibility of its survival is to admit that extinction, that sacred pillar of biological order, might not be absolute. It would unravel too many hierarchies, too many certainties built on the illusion that we have finished discovering. Even now, in marine research circles, a quiet censorship persists. A scientist who publishes an anomalous finding risks being labeled speculative. A grant can vanish overnight. Careers dissolve faster than evidence. It's not conspiracy. It's culture. The machinery of consensus protecting itself from the disorder of wonder. But beneath that silence, fragments still circulate. Emails, conference murmurs, late-night exchanges between divers and engineers. The scattered rumor of something seen or heard, filed under deep anomalies. Some researchers even trade the data in secret, encoded under harmless file names. They call it black biology. One such dataset leaked briefly in 2019, a hydroacoustic recording from the South Pacific, showing pressure waves consistent with a moving mass several hundred tons in weight. The sound signature was cyclical, organic. The recording lasted 6 minutes before being cut. Within hours, the file vanished from every mirror it had been uploaded to. The source laboratory denied its existence. Those who'd heard it described the noise as not loud, but enormous, like something exhaling through stone. It's strange how quickly data disappears when it refuses to stay quiet. And it isn't only modern science that conceals. Even ancient archives show signs of selective memory. Certain cultures, Polynesian, South American, Southeast Asian, all carry fragmented myths of the deep sleeper, the god that sank, or the hunger beneath. Stories of colossal sea creatures that retreated into darkness, promising to return when the surface grew arrogant again. Many of those records were later edited by colonial translators who removed the fantastical elements. They called it purification of myth. But myth is how ancient science speaks, symbol encoded as story. When we erase the myth, we erase the data it protects. And so, across generations, the truth gets thinner. The shark becomes legend. The legend becomes metaphor, and the metaphor becomes nothing at all. There's a symmetry in that. The same process happening in science and culture alike. Both erase what they can't classify. Both pretend silence equals closure. But silence, like the sea, has layers. Perhaps that's why so many of the greatest discoveries in oceanography come from accidents. From the few moments when instruments fail to filter the impossible. A misread signal, a distorted camera feed, a shadow mistaken for a rock formation until it moves. Discovery begins where protocol ends. Still, those who reach too far often pay quietly. Dr. Amara Lowen, the molecular paleobiologist who hinted at unexplained DNA fragments in Megalodon fossils, resigned from her university a year after her conference statement. No scandal, no public notice. She simply disappeared from the academic record. Her laboratory was absorbed by a new marine genomics initiative. The project name changed, the data reclassified. A year later, a new press release claimed, "No trace of prehistoric contamination detected in modern samples." It was as though her words had never been spoken. When knowledge threatens the structure that contains it, the structure absorbs the knowledge. Maybe that's what happened to the Megalodon itself. Absorbed by the ocean's own structure. Still there but distributed, dissolved, hidden in plain sight. The mechanisms are the same: concealment by diffusion. Spread the anomaly so wide it becomes background noise. The ocean does it with pressure. Institutions do it with bureaucracy. Either way, the result is silence that feels natural. And in that silence, curiosity survives, whispered through rumors, encrypted in data, lingering in the gaps between what's allowed to be known and what refuses to die. The truth about the Megalodon may never be written in journals or shown in documentaries. It might only live in those unrecorded moments, when a sonar operator feels a pulse too steady to be current, when a diver sees a shadow too symmetrical to be chance, when a scientist dreams of a sound she's not supposed to remember, because maybe the greatest act of control isn't hiding the evidence. It's convincing us that the search itself is madness. And that's how extinction begins, not in the ocean, but in the mind. Every age of the ocean has a rhythm, a rise and fall, a pulse that beats through water, pressure, and life itself. We tend to think of extinction as a fixed point, a full stop at the end of a sentence. But what if it's more like a breath, drawn in and held, waiting for the next exhale? Perhaps the Megalodon was never erased, only suspended between one heartbeat of the Earth and the next. If you watch the ocean long enough, you start to feel that rhythm, the slow pulse of tides that seem older than time. Each current a vein, each trench a lung. And somewhere deep inside that body, something moves to its own ancient cadence, beyond our calendars and measurements. Maybe extinction, like sleep, is only a phase of rest. There's an old theory whispered among certain marine ecologists that the ocean maintains its balance through what they call recurring apexes. Species that rise, dominate, vanish, and then reappear in some altered form when the ecosystem demands them. Each one born from the same pattern of hunger and need, the same blueprint hidden within evolution's architecture. Sharks, whales, cephalopods, each has had its turn as the ocean's regulator. When one disappears, another emerges, carrying the same rhythm under a different skin. The Megalodon, in this view, wasn't a mistake of evolution. It was a pulse, one beat in a larger ongoing cycle. When the seas grew warm and rich in prey, the giant awoke to feed. When the balance shifted, it sank again into silence. The rhythm doesn't die. It waits. Some marine biologists point to the regularity of oceanic turnover. Mass die-offs every few million years, followed by sudden resurgences of size and predation. The record is incomplete, but the pattern repeats. The sea seems to remember giants when it needs them, and perhaps quietly, it remembers still. Recent satellite data shows that whale populations in certain southern corridors are behaving strangely, migrating off-season, diving deeper than ever recorded. At the same time, sonar networks detect low-frequency tremors echoing from the abyss, rhythmic and vast, too organized to be random tectonic noise. Scientists call it microseismic resonance, but the timing is uncanny. Every pulse coincides with the movements of those whales, as if something enormous were stirring beneath them, dictating the tempo of their flight. There's another piece of the puzzle: temperature anomalies, the invisible signatures of life. Large masses of water moving together can create thermal ghosts, trails of warmth or cold that persist long after the body has passed. In 2018, oceanographers mapping currents off Chile recorded a band of cold water cutting across the warm surface like a scar. It moved east to west, unbroken, over hundreds of kilometers. At first, they blamed upwelling, but the formation was too clean, too deliberate. It curved around the edges of seamounts as though guided by awareness. The sea has always been the planet's subconscious, shifting quietly, holding memory where we cannot. If the Megalodon truly endures, Perhaps it does not live as a creature, but as a mechanism, a living function woven into the ocean's pulse. Something that wakes only when balance demands correction. It wouldn't be the first time the world resurrected its own guardians. When the forests regrew after the Permian extinction, insects swelled to the size of hawks, reclaiming the sky. When the coelacanth re-emerged, it brought with it the physiology of an age thought forgotten. Evolution is not a straight line. It is a loop, a slow turning wheel powered by necessity and memory. Perhaps the Megalodon is that necessity given form. The hunger the ocean calls upon to cleanse itself, to remind the living that balance is never permanent. There are patterns even in mystery. Every few decades, a cluster of unexplainable events breaks through. A whale carcass vanishing mid-descent, a sonar anomaly logged then redacted, a fragment of reworked fossil that seems too young, too sharp. We treat them as coincidences, but maybe they're glimpses of the same recurring rhythm. The faint crest of a cycle too vast for human time. The ocean doesn't forget. It simply measures differently. Once, during a marine geology symposium, an elderly researcher stood up after a presentation about the Megalodon and said something that silenced the room. "We keep asking whether it survived," he said. "The better question is whether it ever truly left." Silence followed. No one wanted to chase that thought too far. Because if the Megalodon never left, it means the story of extinction is less about biology and more about perception. That we mistake invisibility for absence, dormancy for death. It's possible that the creature has become a traveler of epochs, not by movement through space, but through time. That its lineage flows beneath the surface of history, untouched by our definitions. When we say extinct, we mean unseen. When the ocean says extinct, it might mean waiting, and isn't waiting its own kind of survival. In the archives of forgotten biology, there are descriptions of pale recurrence, species that reappear long after presumed extinction, identical in structure but adapted to new climates. Science explains this as evolutionary convergence, but the repetition is uncanny. The same forms, the same proportions, as though creation keeps tracing the same outline. The Megalodon may not return as flesh and fin, but as form. Another predator born with its pattern, its hunger, its memory. Maybe that's what the ocean has been preparing for with its subtle changes. Colder currents mixing with warmer flows, the rearranging of deep corridors, the awakening of methane vents, an ecosystem shifting into a state of readiness. Every age has its keeper, its quiet regulator. And the ocean, being older than civilization, does not choose gently. In a way, humanity has become the new imbalance, draining, warming, deafening the waters. If the ocean has a consciousness, if it keeps memory, if it knows the ancient rhythm of predator and prey, perhaps the next correction is already on its way. Not vengeance, not myth, just equilibrium. And when that time comes, the Megalodon won't rise as a monster from storybooks. It will come as a shadow that moves through the deep with purpose, older than names, older than our arrogance. The water will feel different. The sonar will hum a little lower. The whales will change their routes. We won't notice it first. Balance never announces itself. It just happens. And maybe one night, beneath the static of hydrophones and the endless breathing of the sea, someone will hear a pulse. Slow, rhythmic, familiar. The echo of a hunger that never truly ended. The return of the abyss is not a spectacle. It is a heartbeat finding its way back to the world. At a certain depth, light and sound collapse into the same color. A blue so dense it feels alive. Down there, time moves differently. Pressure bends it, stretches it, slows it to a whisper. The instruments we lower into that darkness record only fragments, incomplete thoughts from the planet's unconscious. But sometimes, in that hush where technology falters, a different kind of clarity appears. A stillness too perfect to be empty. A silence that feels aware. The deeper you descend, the more the ocean becomes a mirror. Every pulse of sonar, every flicker of light comes back altered, as if the water itself were responding, rewriting what it receives. Scientists call it refraction. Philosophers might call it memory. Maybe that's what we've been chasing all along, not a creature, but a reflection of our own forgetting. The Megalodon is the name we give to the dark shape beneath our reason, the proof that knowledge is not the same as understanding. When we stare into that abyss, we aren't just looking for evidence. We're asking a question we're afraid to articulate. How much of what we call lost is simply waiting for us to quiet down and listen? The last recordings from the hydrophone arrays tell a strange story. For months, no signals. Then, without warning, a resonance. A pulse too slow to measure, too vast to locate. It filled every channel simultaneously, vibrating through thousands of kilometers of water. For several seconds, the ocean itself seemed to breathe. And then, silence again. The analysis concluded that the event was instrumental feedback. Yet the engineers who heard it described the feeling as physical, like standing inside the echo of something enormous turning over in its sleep. One technician wrote in his log, "It didn't sound like sound. It sounded like intention." There is something about that word, intention, that stays with me. If life is simply the universe organizing itself into awareness, then perhaps the ocean, too, has intentions. And perhaps the creatures we call extinct are only the organs through which those intentions once expressed themselves. The Megalodon might have been one such expression. The ocean's will made flesh, its balance given form. If so, then what we call its extinction may have been no more than the sea-shifting tone. The hunger didn't vanish. It only changed key. We have always mistaken disappearance for mercy. We think that when the giants go silent, the story ends. But in the geological sense, silence is only the pause between catastrophes. The planet moves in circles, and every silence ends the same way, with something stirring in the dark. The Megalodon is part of that cycle, a recurring chord in the music of the earth. It comes when the water warms, when the prey multiply, when imbalance needs a mouth large enough to swallow it. The ocean breathes, the hunter wakes, the scale resets. Then it sleeps again, always sleeping, never gone. Somewhere in the black trenches, beneath continents of pressure, that dream continues. Maybe as a single creature, maybe as a lineage, maybe as a rhythm too deep for our machines to follow. We don't need to see it to know it's there. The signs are already written in motion. Whales changing routes, the sonar returning echoes shaped like spines, the cold corridors blooming with new life. The sea is preparing. It always prepares before remembering. We call it mystery because we still believe we're separate from it. But the truth is simpler and more frightening. The ocean is not another world. It is the body of this one. And what we think of as monsters are only its immune responses, its way of maintaining equilibrium when we grow too loud. If you listen to the deep long enough, it begins to sound like breathing. The spaces between those breaths are where everything happens. Extinction, rebirth, migration, forgetting. Maybe the Megalodon was never just an animal. Maybe it was a function of that breath. A reminder that the planet itself is alive, and that every life within it is a sentence spoken in its larger language. We were never meant to understand the full grammar of that language. We only ever catch fragments. A pulse, a shadow, a tooth. Evidence that the story is still being written. And yet, in the quiet hours, When the waves flatten and the horizon folds into night, something inside us leans toward that darkness. The same part that dreams of dragons and gods, of vanished continents and sleeping giants. The same part that recognizes hunger as sacred, not savage. It's possible the Megalodon survives, yes, but it's equally possible that survival was never the point. Maybe what endures is not the creature, but the idea of it, the echo that keeps the ocean honest, the reminder that no amount of naming can cage the unknown. Because in the end, what truly frightens us is not the thought that something still lives beneath us, but that it always has, watching, listening, waiting for us to remember our place. So we build lights, sonar, theories, and still the deep refuses to yield. It waits, patient as pressure, eternal as water. Perhaps that's why every story about the Megalodon, no matter how it begins, ends the same way. With silence. A silence that isn't empty, but full. The pause before awakening. The moment when you realize the ocean doesn't need to prove itself real. And maybe one day, when the last machine fails and the last diver drifts too far, the sea will open its eyes again. Not to punish, not to reveal, but to remind. Because everything we have ever lost in the ocean, every fossil, every sound, every secret, is still there, folded into the blue, waiting for us to grow still enough to hear the oldest truth of all. Nothing in this world ever truly disappears. It only sinks deeper.